Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. Today's program concludes our conversation with Lina Lenberg, a grade 6 humanities teacher at Presidio Hill School in San Francisco, California, and a leading scholar on the genocide of Uyghurs in China. In this episode, Lina discusses her activism in the San Francisco Bay Area regarding the Uyghur genocide, how she has helped bridge the gap between Holocaust and genocide studies and human rights education, the relationship of human rights education to social justice, how human rights education can be deployed to address emergent threats to human rights in the United States and globally, as well as role models who have inspired her work in human rights education and her recommendations for advancing it in the United States. Well, it's interesting we're talking about genocide because I think historically there has been sort of a silo problem with study of genocide and the Holocaust on one side and human rights on another side, or human rights education. And I'm wondering how you explain that. What do you think accounts for this sort of siloed situation?
Yeah, it's a weird thing, this siloed world of education, because for me, it seems very natural that all of these different topics are interrelated and deeply interconnected, and particularly when we're talking about genocide studies and human rights education. So yeah, I think it's really unfortunate that genocide education and HRE are not more closely related, because I see them as being directly related. You know, genocide is an extreme form of multiple human rights violations, and I think it can be examined as such, and of course taking into account different cultural and historical factors. And I do think genocide scholars refer to different conventions, you know, most notably probably the Genocide Convention, but there are other ones like the Convention Against Torture, sometimes CEDAW, sometimes the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So these are obviously human rights documents and fall within the realm of human rights education, even though explicit connections might not be made to human rights education. And also, you know, calls of never again within the world of genocide studies, I think, imply a responsibility to prevent and stop further atrocities, which I think also falls within the realm of human rights education, the sense of you learn and then you do something about it. So, you know, in my own teaching, I include the genocide of indigenous peoples in the United States, and particularly in California, to emphasize what happened on the very land on which we operate every single day. I also teach about the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, the Cambodian genocide, the Rohingya genocide, the Rwandan genocide, of course, the Uyghur genocide. And then at USF, I mentioned I teach that class on human rights law and advocacy with a focus on genocide. And that is something that human rights education students can take as part of their human rights education concentration. And I know there are other academic spaces where genocide studies and HRA are linked, like at UC Davis. There's a great program that includes a genocide studies class as part of their human rights education program. And, you know, I really think part of the beauty of human rights education is that it is so broad. And of course, time is limited, and there's so much happening in the world. So, you know, it's really up to human rights educators to include what they think is relevant and important. And I would love to see more of an explicit link between genocide studies and HRE, because it seems a very natural connection to me, because the content is already so interwoven.
Well, it seems to me that you can't have a genocide without preconditions of human rights violations.
Agreed. Yes. So it is strange. And, you know, probably funding and other practical logistical issues are partly to explain for this continued siloed nature. But I hope we can make an effort to bridge these varying fields. And, you know, specifically genocide studies and HRE seem to me to be completely interlinked.
Well, I think your work is a good model, actually, to take a look at that because of how your career's own trajectory has moved in that direction.
Thank you.
So I want to talk a little bit about social justice. Now, this has
Mhm.
become a very vibrant conversation in the human rights education community. What is the relationship between human rights education and social justice, whether it's race or issues of culture and so forth? So, how do you see that today, particularly in what I think it's fair to say is a rather polarized political situation in the United States?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, my hope is that human rights education can lead to conditions of social justice. I feel like the term social justice has become so widely used that sometimes it loses its meaning, even. But what I see is the possibility of HRE to empower people to learn troubling histories, to develop empathy and understanding, to build solidarity, and to freedom dream for a better world, which includes multiple perspectives, multiple truths, and honors and even celebrates our common humanity, and of course we can't achieve this without first understanding and then working to dismantle systems of power and oppression. And we've seen that international accountability mechanisms are not always effective, but I think this is all the more a call for each of us to consider how we can contribute to creating a more just and equitable world. And so I feel like using human rights education in order to achieve social justice is possible. And, I really don't believe that this intense divisiveness that we're experiencing nationally and globally is going to lead to a sustainable solution. We have to work toward our collective liberation and build solidarity. And I think that HRE, particularly the for and through parts of human rights education, can help to grow understanding, and ideally in turn can reduce animosity, hatred, xenophobia, and so much more, with an eye toward changing for the better, working to build an inclusive world where everyone can show up as their authentic self and belong, contribute, be valued, and even be celebrated. Discrimination, xenophobia, these things are learned, right? Babies are not born hateful. So I feel that something better can be learned instead. And of course, this requires a concerted and consistent intention and effort. But I think human rights education can be the thing that can help us to reach these conditions of, more equitable conditions for a more just world. And I know that some of this sounds naive or, even entitled, but I like to remind myself that there are no limits to dreaming. And, this is what I encourage my students to do too. Even if we can't achieve what we ideally hope, we have to be able to envision something better. And for me, that's where it starts, and that's where hope lives for me too. My students provide me with hope of a better future every day. Kids are ready for change. The kids want to engage and make things better for everyone. And so I think if there's a collective envisioning of something better and a goal to achieve this, then it makes it seem much more possible.
Do you believe that a universal ethos of care, and a universal ethics is essential for moving in that direction?
I want to say yes, but I think that I mean, ideally yes, and I think within that we have to account for cultural differences, philosophical differences, religious differences, linguistic differences. I think that the concept of universality for me has become a little bit problematic. Like ideally, I support these concepts of, universal care, universal various things. And I think sometimes in the discourse of universality, the details of different specific cultures and belief systems are not always included, because I think that the global human rights system, has been driven in large part by the things happening after World War II. And I think that, European and Western powers were largely involved in that. And I don't know that Indigenous voices and other communities were included to a full extent. And so now I hope we can broaden when we talk about, for example, as you say, like a system of care. What does that look like from multiple perspectives? Like maybe it's not just a single way, but there are multiple ways. And that's how I feel we should move forward is yes, working toward this universal way of caring, respecting, valuing one another. But within that, we have to ensure that we are including all, as many different voices and perspectives as we can in order to even understand what that means, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think that you've hit on an interesting issue about the notion of the legacy of colonization, the legacy of imperialism, which has a huge impact, actually. And I think is something that we're just coming to grips with in a more detailed manner today,
Mhm.
particularly in academic work, because that has had a huge legacy, particularly in former colonies and their education systems and legal systems and so forth. So I think it's important that we sort of take that and look at it and say, all right, well, what are the ways that have not been emphasized and see how
Mhm.
they can contribute? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
So today, and I think, it's a fair statement to say that we have some very serious threats to human rights in the United States, whether it's academic freedom limitations, censorship, voting rights restrictions, violence against minorities, and so forth. How would you and how do you use human rights education to address any one of those challenges? And you can talk about any specific one, but I'd like you to think about how it impacts children.
Mm. So I just want to first say that, I've heard my students say so many times, children are humans too, and they know things, and they're very capable. And I feel that we are here to guide them to become their best selves engaged in the world, not to restrict their access to learning. And so all of this book banning in particular has been very troubling. And the kids are already contending with so many things today. And I'm grateful that mental health is something that's become more openly talked about, at least in our society, because the kids are not all right. And when I think about LGBTQ plus youth in particular, we already know that they are grappling with depression, suicide at higher rates than some of their peers. And a lot of resources related to LGBT plus identities and histories are being banned. And so these kids especially need access. They need access to books. They need guided discussions. They need support. They need to have their identities affirmed rather than discounted or hidden or even shamed. So I really strongly believe we are not serving our students by sheltering them and limiting their access to multiple perspectives, which would only serve to cultivate understanding and compassion. So all of the book banning, I feel, is really only going to harm our society as a whole by limiting access to information, by privileging only certain dominant perspectives, which are often discriminatory, and also, encouraging ignorance in this way. So I think talking about these issues openly, learning about rights in multiple contexts, both, present day and I think historically and historical precedents to what is happening in the present day, and then advocating for rights. This is something that needs to continue to happen on multiple fronts. And, as I've already said, the kids are already primed to do this work. They want to engage in this work. They are well aware of what they are experiencing and what their peers are experiencing. They are well aware of things that are happening in the world. Shootings are something also that is at the top of their mind for years now. In middle school, the kids are really concerned about gun violence and various other things. And for us to not talk to them or provide spaces for them to better understand these issues and think about how they can advocate for change, I feel is a huge disservice for them, but also for our society as a whole. The kids are the ones who are going to change the world. And so I feel we need to help them, provide them with tools, and at the very least, see them and respect them and encourage them to be their authentic selves.
So, would you, for example, advocate using human rights education to advance initiatives to turn over book bans, to turn against academic censorship?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think, we know education is a human right. And if we look at what education looks like in terms of the right that is defined, it's to the fullest development of our human selves. And so I think, yeah, advocating for access to resources, for academic freedom, these are all included within that.
So, today we have a rather challenging situation in that there are authoritarian regimes in the world, China being one, Hungary, Venezuela, uh, Russia, and others, where authoritarianism is given a very high level of support, at least by the state.
Mhm.
And of course, in the United States, the Republican Party seems to be focused on authoritarianism under the current leading person in their primaries. So, how do you advance human rights education in that type of environment?
Yeah, I mean, we'll have to see what happens in the global elections in the coming year. But I suspect we'll continue to have to make a really concerted effort to include HRE in curricula. And we'll definitely have our work cut out for us. But I also feel like the work has been cut out for us probably from the beginning, because not everybody supports this. And human rights education's been around for a while, but it's still not really a part of mainstream teacher education programs or learning or training. And so it may be that we'll have to redouble our efforts to continue to push for human rights education in various spheres. And I think no matter who the leadership is at any given moment, there are always factions within society that may be opposed to human rights education. And so I sort of see it as whatever is happening with leadership, our work has to continue. And so, and I also want to say here that I really think the beauty of an organization like HRE USA is in knowing that there are so many of us who do see the value in human rights education and want education to be used as a powerful force for social change. And I find strength and encouragement personally in knowing that I'm part of this larger community that cares about changing the world through education and respecting and upholding human rights for all. And HRE reminds us that human rights are for everyone just by virtue of being human. They're not selective. And this is an incredibly powerful idea that motivates me to continue to do this work. And I see HRE ultimately as a vehicle for social change to create this world where everyone's rights are respected and upheld. And so I think together, if we continue pushing collectively, that makes us more powerful. And I hope that eventually this will become something that is more widely integrated into education as a whole.
Well, you strike on an issue that has come up in a number of our episodes, and that is this challenge of trying to change institutional priorities.
Mm.
And as you know, there are not very many states that require human rights education in teacher training, if at all.
Mm-hmm.
So, what do you think should be the next step, let's say in California, to try to deal with that?
I think 100% HRE should be included in educator training and credentialing or certification programs to normalize human rights education as part of teaching and learning. And, again, there's been a lot of talk of social justice, and people are talking about social justice education. And I feel like human rights education goes hand in hand with that. And so more education about what human rights education is would be a great thing. And, definitely I would also invest resources into professional development, which focuses on HRE. And for teachers and administrators, I think school leaders need to be educated in these things in order to support their teachers who are implementing these, on the ground in the classrooms. And, of course, ideally, I would also love to increase teacher salaries, focus on work-life integration for educators, provide funding for wellness programs to prevent burnout. And there should also be, I think, robust mentoring programs for new teachers or those who are new to HRE. I would definitely also include HRE in curriculum statewide and not just in social studies. I think that often we think of this as part of social studies, but I believe that human rights education can be part of every subject at every grade level. And I think it's never too soon to start learning to value and appreciate differences and cultivate a culture of inclusion and belonging for everyone. And, if we really want HRE to be successful, we have to designate resources to train and support the people who are implementing it in their various settings, whether it's educational or otherwise. There are other community, sort of more informal educational settings. So yeah, part of teacher education programs, support at school sites, maybe even on a district level, and designated resources for training and continued support of human rights education, while also resources to help prevent burnout so that people can continue to engage in this work, because it is intense. It's very intense work. And educators already are contending with so many things in their classrooms, in their districts, at multiple levels. And so I think if we want this to be successful, we have to invest resources and provide ongoing support.
I have three questions that are standard for every person we interview. So let me go to the first one. Who would be the most influential role model for your HRE work?
Well, I have to say my former advisor and forever mentor and role model, Dr. Monisha Bajaj, has been instrumental, and it just so inspiring and encouraging, and remains someone who I deeply admire and respect. And I know you recently interviewed her for this podcast, and she writes, teaches, travels, mentors. She's a parent. She's an unwaveringly supportive, brilliant, and generous person and colleague. And I've also been really fortunate to have a lot of incredible teachers and mentors here in the Bay Area. So I'm just going to name Nancy Flowers, Susan Katz, Sandy Sohat, and so many other committed and inspiring people. And then in terms of people that I don't know personally, I often turn to the wisdom of Bell Hooks and Grace Lee Boggs, both who always inspire me to root my work in love and community.
Well, some of those are on the all-star team of human rights education. That was interesting. You mentioned a whole bunch. Okay, so what is a quote that most effectively sums up your view of the importance of human rights education?
Yeah, so more and more urgently, I feel like HRE should be oriented toward action, toward enacting positive social change for our collective liberation. And I have recently discovered in the last few years somebody named Ruha Benjamin, who's an incredible scholar on the East Coast presently. And she says to remember to imagine and craft the worlds you cannot live without, just as you dismantle the ones you cannot live within.
That makes a lot of sense. I agree. And finally, if you had the power to make one critical change to advance human rights education in the United States, what would you recommend?
I think what we were just speaking about a few minutes ago, include human rights education in educator training and certification programs to normalize human rights education as part of teaching and learning, that it should just be an expected part of what students are engaging with throughout their education.
So do you think if that is a long-term goal, there are other pathways to try to make that happen? For example, if you don't work through the licensure system, couldn't there be for lack of a better term, a non-formal system by which you bring people together to learn about it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think community education is super powerful. I think that sometimes we think of official, like formal classroom settings, but I think community education can be equally, if not more powerful. And so I would love to see a robust human rights education program that engages people in multiple roles, in multiple spaces within society. And of course that requires resources. And so there would have to be an allocation of resources to do that. But yeah, I think engaging people in multiple spaces and even maybe offering some kind of a certification in human rights education is sometimes motivating. So that could also work.
Right. You're sort of suggesting a popular education movement like the ones that may have or have existed in Latin America for many years, and moving that beyond, let's say, the confines of K through university education.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Lina, it's been such a great pleasure to talk with you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's really been an honor to be here. Thank you so much, Bill.
Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HRE USA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Pocket Casts, Player FM, and Deezer. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy at hreusa.org. That's KRISTI at hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes producer and editor Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Redelius Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gota. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.